Good afternoon, everyone. We appreciate you joining us for our Top 10 Reasons Why Supplier Qualification Fails and 10 Ways to Succeed webinar. My name is Brett Armstrong. I'll be moderating the discussion today, and I want to take just a minute to introduce you to today's presenters. First, we have Gil Dieckhoff, Browse Director of Professional Services. He's an industry expert in the areas of supplier qualification and health and safety. Before coming to Browse, Gil had 20 years experience in health and safety at Caterpillar. In 2008, he led a multifunctional team that benchmarked 13 Fortune 500 companies and used this data to develop Caterpillar's corporate-level contractor safety management process. He then served as corporate process owner for contractor safety management for the next 4 years. During this time, Gil led the implementation of Browse at Caterpillar. It was located in the U.S., UK, Germany, and India. Over the past 5 years, many global companies have benchmarked the process that Gil developed for Caterpillar. Given this experience, Gil has relevant knowledge of this evolving industry and what has been designed and implemented as a supplier management process that will work and provide real value for a company, whether it be small or a family-owned business or a large and highly successful global organization. Next, I'd like to introduce you to Pat Cunningham, or the Browse Safety Guy. Pat has a master's in occupational health and safety management and over 25 years of experience in the field of safety. In addition to his appointment to the VPPPA Education Committee, Pat is also a delegate to the National Safety Council. Prior to Browse, Pat worked for Xcel Energy as the Director of Corporate Safety. During that time, he was tasked with forming a contractor safety and qualification department for Xcel Energy. With his new department, Pat and Xcel Energy gained significant insight into the metrics of supply chain compliance, the company protocols, the need for in-house employee training, supplier training, and internal compliance of company policy. One last thing before I hand the time over to Gil is to mention that there will be a time for questions. We will hold a Q&A forum at the end of this webinar. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, there's a Q&A function that you'll have access to. Please type your questions into the free text area, and could I ask that you please ensure you specify all panelists and hosts so that the questions are distributed to all presenters. If we don't get a chance to answer everyone's questions, we will follow up with you individually and contact you following the webinar. With that, I'd like to thank Gil and turn the time over to him.
Great, thanks, Brett. Appreciate it. Yeah, so as we start through the process, again, we're going to focus on, the title of the presentation is Top 10 Reasons Why Supplier Qualification Fails, Supplier, and you'll probably catch me interchanging the words supplier and contractor and supply base maybe, something like that, but in effect I'm really talking about the same group. But as we go through, we won't just talk about the negative side to it. We'll also talk about some of the ways or some of the solutions or steps that you can take to actually make your supplier pre-qualification process successful. And so probably the first question that we need to address is, why do we need to qualify the supply chain? And I think probably critical to any business or operation is the ability to identify risk and then put a plan in place to control or mitigate that risk. And that's really what we're trying to accomplish when we talk about pre-qualifying a supply chain, is identifying the risk that's there and then making sure that we have a solid plan in place to mitigate that risk. And that risk can really come from a couple of different areas. I think most of the time, the primary focus is typically on health and safety type risk or issues, perhaps environmental issues as well. But there are a lot of programs and a lot of companies out there whose pre-qualification looks at more than just the health and safety risk, although again, it typically is the keystone. But you can also identify and manage risk in other areas, including financial risk, legal risk, regulatory type risk. All of those things come into play. And again, developing and utilizing a strong pre-qualification program can really help the company to both identify and then mitigate that risk. That's one of the reasons why many leading companies are finding this an important process. Another critical point is brand protection. And if you're with a bigger company, this probably is second nature to you. If you're with a smaller company, you may not think about it that much. But the fact of the matter is what our supply chain is involved with, what our contractors and suppliers are doing on our sites, typically it involves risk. I mean, that's why we're looking at this. And so there's always the potential for, some type of bad event. And the problem with that is, and some of you may have experienced this, but there's certainly a potential for your company to get some bad or unfair recognition in the press because some type of event happened on your company property or a work site you supervise, and automatically in the press that incident gets associated with your company name, even though it may not have, been under your control. Maybe it was, a supplier or a contractor type incident. So it's becoming more and more common, especially in the U.S., for there to be some blurring of the lines between suppliers and clients on both the regulatory and the legal side. And so that it really does play a role in brand protection because a significant event could carry a lot of negative connotations, and your company name may very well be associated with that.
Excellent point, Gil. If anybody's been reading the newspapers lately, they'll see that large corporations are brought into the news press from an event that took place, a negative event that took place, and they rarely will mention the small contractor involved. They'll be the big corporation that is listed there. And from corporations' standpoint, they're going to be looking at the safety risks and also the legal liabilities. It doesn't just end at the event. These events that take place take a corporation years to resolve in some cases, and some of the recent literature coming out of OSHA, they're really looking at this as a joint responsibility between the contractor and the business owner, if you will. So it's important to have both sides of that coin covered, not just your employees, but those working in your facilities.
Yeah, good point, Pat. Thank you. Again, talking about why we go through this slide, I like this slide, and again, I typically don't read or talk to slides, but I think if you look at the items that are important to the customers and have an impact on the customer that you see on this slide, doing that pre-qualification process can help improve in some or in all of these areas your processes in a lot of ways, and that really leads to improvements and happy customers, improvements for the customers and happy customers. And that really leads into the last slide, and that is shareholder value. I think if you go back, a lot of this started purely because of and I think rightfully so, a drive to improve safety across everybody that's at a work site. I think what is also becoming more and more recognized and more important to most companies is the fact that a well-run contractor pre-qualification program can clearly add shareholder value. And if you're in business, especially if you're publicly traded or whatever, shareholder value is a big deal. And being able to manage, identify, and manage risk allows you to reduce costs, both indirect and direct type costs. There's probably everybody on the phone is well familiar with all the types of costs that could be associated with either a environmental health or safety type risk or any of the other risks we talked about, and that has a direct impact to your bottom line. And as Pat indicated, those costs may actually be drug out over years. You may get into a legal battle or something like that, and the costs are going to add up and the time's going to add up. So it does have the real potential to add shareholder value. And I think if you're in business, that's one of the things that you're clearly focused on achieving as a business. Okay, so now we'll move on to the top 10. I'll preface this by saying this list is not in any particular order. It's just based on experience and data and things that we've seen and analyzed over the years, with one exception, and that the exception is the first one I'm going to talk about, which is a lack of leadership commitment. in my experience and all of the information that I've seen seems to support this, this to me is probably the #1 biggest possibility or risk to having a failing contractor pre-qualification process. It really is, you can boil it down pretty simply, but it doesn't mask the significance of it. And the fact is, you have to have a leadership commitment to this type of process because it's going to touch and interact with potentially all the legs of your organization, but certainly multiple sections of your organization. So there's a lot of stakeholders and there's a lot of involvement. And the only way to really get that leadership commitment is to do a very good job of communication, which we'll talk about specifically as we get into this. But a part of that has to be, or a critical part of that communication is, what value does this program provide, or this process? Your leadership's going to want to know that because they're not going to support something that may potentially cost money, may require resources, may require significant change within an organization. They will not support that, get behind that, if they're not convinced it's value added. And so it's critical that as you start down this process, if you're not already involved with it, you put together a very good case for why you need it, and a part of that is the value it adds to the organization. And once you get the leadership commitment behind that, you have all the makings of having a successful and a strong program. But I'll stress it again, I've seen it time and time again, both at the companies I've worked at and countries that I have peers at. If there isn't a strong leadership commitment behind this, in fact, maybe somebody even championing the cause, there's a very real possibility that the program will eventually die.
Excellent point, Gil. This is absolutely the top of the pyramid in a successful program, and it's not just communicating to the leadership the goals and the benefits and costs, but it's also the responsibility of those management personnel to be aware of their messages to their employees and to those that they talk to, and be aware of their direct and indirect communication. A lot of times a person can say the right words, but the body language or the response is telling something different. So they really have to cradle this and believe in it for it to be successful.
Exactly. #2, not understanding internal stakeholder needs. And in fact, I would include external stakeholder needs in this as well. But if you're going to, if you're going to participate and put a program together like this, again, it's going to interact with various groups, various systems, and things like that. And you will never be successful if you don't understand what the stakeholder needs are in addition to the wants. And I think it's also just as important to clearly differentiate between a want and a need. You really, again, it comes back to communication, but in the end, if you're going to get support for this and buy-in and going to have a successful program, the program that you put in place has to meet the needs of the stakeholders that are impacted by it. You may put together a program that can also, go above and beyond and address and provide a solution for some of the wants. And if you can do that, more power to you. But the stakeholders have to have their needs met, or they'll quickly bring the program to a halt, because if it's not meeting their needs, that probably means it's costing them time, resources, and money. And again, if that's not providing value, nobody's going to support that. Another option for, or a potential cause of a process failure is ineffective communication. We've touched on that to some degree in the first couple of slides, but ineffective communication, again, both internally and externally. Again, I've seen a lot of evidence of this and lived through this for a lot of years. If we look at the internal side, we've talked about identifying the stakeholders and their wants and needs. We've talked about getting leadership commitment and support for that. None of that happens without effective communication. So again, you need to put together a very strong case for why we need to do this, how we're going to do it, and what value or benefit it's going to provide to the organization. And it will take, in my experience, it takes a lot of communication repeatedly and very consistently over time until the program really becomes embedded in your culture, so that, again, if somebody misses a key communication or a critical group in your organization doesn't get the right communication, and now all of a sudden they're surprised or caught out by something that they didn't know about, you're immediately going to run into resistance, and it's going to cause problems with your program. It works the same way when you look at it facing out towards your contractors or supply chain. The same type of communications need to happen, and they need to happen up front. Why are we doing this? Who needs to be involved with it? And what are the benefits? And probably the biggest two things they're probably going to ask are, what's the timing and what's it going to cost me? So all of those things have to be a part of your communication to your contractors or your supply chain as well. It's critical to get their support, because without their support, you're not going to have a pre-qualification process.
Excellent point, Gil. And I'll share with you an internal story regarding my experience in industry. Is we were asked to, at the start, I was asked to form a contractor safety department, and this edict came from the board of directors through the CEO, and then mandated down through the organization. So, and this communication was publicized through the various medias that we had available to our corporation. So we felt that communication was sufficient, and then we put our resources into hiring our employees, developing process, training internal and external. We went through the implementation. We did our metrics. We did auditing, external, internal. But we realized there was still a lot of resistance within the company. This was change management. And looking back now, I see that where we missed the mark initially anyway was that communication of why we were doing what we were doing was not sustained from the initial announcement from the executive leadership on down. And for anybody that's implementing a program, that sustained communication needs to be maintained all the way through the effort.
Yeah, I think you hit it right on the head when you said change management. It's typically, this is because it involves so many people and groups, both internal to your own company and facing outward towards your supply chain. The change management process is critical, and obviously the biggest piece of that is communication. So it typically is a big event or a big process, and not planning for it and really using a change management process to help you along can really lead to a failure in this particular area. Lack of supply chain buy-in. Again, this group at your company is probably going to be one of the critical stakeholders, one of a handful of critical stakeholders. And it's important, clearly, that they understand what the process is going to be, and even more importantly, what value it provides to their procurement process. I mean, that's exactly what we're talking about, is the selection and the procurement of supply chain or contractors. That's the job of the supply chain department. So they have to be in this from the beginning. They have to have the ability to have input into how the process is going to work, and they need to be a very active partner in the process, because, again, for me, coming from a very large corporation with to be honest, a huge procurement department, without their support, the program would have never gotten off the ground. And I have seen examples where companies have gone down this path of contractor pre-qualification and maybe only had, slight touch point with their procurement folks or their supply chain folks, and maybe they thought they had their support and understanding. And in fact, I've seen this a couple of times, and it turns out they really didn't. Supply chain really did not understand what was happening and how it's going to impact with their systems and their processes. And in both of those cases, the pre-qualification program ground to a halt almost immediately. In one case, it failed entirely. In the second case, it took that particular company, I'm going to say, the better part of a year to really get the bugs worked out of it, get supply chain involved, and get it reinvigorated. So they are a key player in this. And to be honest, again, most of this initially, I guess, gets driven by safety. It is starting to become a more prevalent concern of the supply chain teams at business, but really it starts off on safety, and that's why it's so important to get the supply chain folks involved. Another potential failure point is poorly defined or inappropriate standards. We really like to say, or I like to say, when you start with a program like this, you have to use kind of a crawl, walk, run model. You could have the very best intentions in mind when you set up your selection criteria or the metrics that you're going to use to pre-qualify or select your contractors. But I think a dose of realism quickly comes into play in that aiming for, you know, the tip of the spear type of program in your first couple of weeks of implementation, I'm not going to say it's impossible, but a lot of times it's very hard, and we clearly found that out at Caterpillar. We didn't know as much about our supply chain as we thought we did, and so setting up selection criteria or rules that you're measuring those folks by, you really need to have some good input into it, and you need to start, my counsel would be to start off relatively simple, but you still have to have a process in place that provides value, and you're not just going through the motions. But this is another one where I've seen multiple real-world examples of where the standards were either too hard to meet for the supply chain initially, or in some cases they were too cookie cutter, they were too standardized, and those requirements or standards were applied to everybody, but in effect really didn't apply to some of those people, and so they had no potential way to meet those requirements. And a lot of thought needs to go into this. We actually worked with a pretty good group of our contractors at Caterpillar. They were actually a part of the team that worked with us when we went through this, and they gave us a lot of feedback, and it really helped us understand where they were at as far as the things that we were looking to measure them on. And so a real partnership in that area and a lot of thoughtful development will go a long way in making sure this is not a failure point of your program. Okay, what are the consequences of non-compliance? In other words, if you don't enforce the program and you put it in place, almost without question, your program is going to fail. And this also, I think, is two sides to the coin. It's internal enforcement, in other words, within your own company. If you've got the stakeholder approval, agreement, support, buy-in, you should not have a problem enforcing this, especially if you've done a good change management process and you've communicated up front how the process is going to work. On the other hand, if you set up rules and you do a pre-qualification process and you don't enforce it equally, it lends itself to a multitude of problems. Internal problems would be, certain groups or users or whatever find out that it's not being enforced. As soon as they find that out, they'll typically bypass the process. And if they bypass the process and you're not able to pre-qualify those contractors, you've just lost the foundation of the whole program, and that's identifying risk and finding a way to control it. So that's a critical failure point. I also think word of that will spread through your supply chain, and they will see it as a negative. And so if your supply chain somehow finds out that you're not enforcing the rules equally across the board, that word will spread. Contractors talk to each other, and it'll really bring up some hard feelings, and I think it will really call into question the integrity of the company and the leadership, because it true or false, it lends the perception that there's bias, or there's the old boys club or whatever that's now making the decisions on who gets business and who doesn't. And so again, I would counsel you, put a program together, make sure it has checks and balances, make sure it has teeth, and then live by those rules and enforce that. Or again, it's a clear failure point in the process.
Excellent point, Gil. Another way of looking at it is parenting 101. You have to set some rules and make sure that they're fair, and then follow those rules and hold people accountable.
Good point. You may run into situations where a contractor or supplier just simply refuses to participate in the program. You may hear, I won't do it, I'm not going to do it. In my experience, that only comes from a very small percentage of the supply chain. There's multiple reasons for that. A lot of times they simply don't understand what the process is or what's being asked of them. There's concerns with confidentiality of information and things like that. Other concerns are their cost, the cost to them of the program. You know, all good concerns, but I think if you develop the proper program, you have very good answers to that, and that is that the program will provide solutions and it will provide value and benefit to your supply chain just as well as it does to your own internal organization. But there are a lot of different reasons, like I said. Some people will just say the process is too cumbersome. You know, it's not worth it for us in the time and the money invested for the amount of business we do with you, so we're not going to do it. We'll just get business elsewhere. You know, you may or may not be able to prevent that. And actually that kind of brings back the supply chain piece. I've seen different companies do this, and supply chain and different organizations are working towards different goals. And again, I think you need to identify that up front. Some supply chains will see this as a benefit, as a tool to shrink their supply base and therefore reduce costs. I've seen other companies where, you know, purchasing or the procurement group saw this as a way to actually increase their access to suppliers or contractors, thereby giving them more options. And so make sure you understand if your procurement group has a strong feeling one way or the other on how this tool will be used, that you work in association to make sure that the process runs that way.
Excellent, Gil. You know, this is a real concern that each company has to face when they enter into a contractor pre-qualification program, whether they're doing it in-house or using a managed program system. And when I was with Xcel Energy, we experienced both of those scenarios. When we did it in-house, we had a concern about will our suppliers follow us? Will they go through the steps of what we're asking them to do? And then when we went into a managed system, we thought again, will they pay the fees to collect this? And so companies do a good job of introducing costs and explaining costs, but where it really comes into is spending time with the suppliers, expressing the actual benefit to them, where we found out that companies that go through a managed system, their safety programs actually get better for going through that process. Going through that rigor actually improves their own safety program.
Yeah, and that's I mean, that's a win-win for everybody, because if you're improving a contractor's performance, then you're reducing their risk. And again, that's really what is driving these processes. And it's a win-win for everybody, because if you're reducing risk on your work site, whether it's coming from your own employees or contractor supply chain employees that are on your site, the fact is they're all working in the same areas in the same proximity, and so that risk can carry over to, you know, amongst different populations. And so again, it all comes down to identifying the risk and putting a plan in place or a control in place to limit that risk. Excellent point. Okay, lack of sophisticated technology. If you go back 10 years or whatever, maybe this wasn't as big of an issue, but as companies continue to grow, as regulatory requirements continue to grow, as more and more companies continue to rely on supply chain sources to do a lot of work that they used to do internally, the greater the potential for the system to become bigger and bigger and bigger. And it becomes very hard to really manage this type of process, you know, on a large scale, at least, through spreadsheets and paper documents and file folders and things like that. It just becomes too complex and too burdensome. And so if you can take the benefit of using a more sophisticated technology, whatever that might be, web-based solutions or whatever that helps streamline, speed up the process, automate the process, you'll find that it runs and works a lot more smoothly. It's just, at least in the U.S., this is the way things are going. You know, a lot of the big companies know what their areas of expertise and their strengths and weaknesses are, and they use supply chain to do all of those things that aren't their strengths that they used to do internally. And so again, the bigger your company, the bigger the potential failure in this area if you're using an outmoded system to try to manage the process. This was one that we ran headfirst into at Caterpillar in my experience, and that's underestimating the need for administrative support. We went out, when we did our benchmarking, again, we looked at a large number of Fortune 500 companies, a lot of our peers, and we benchmarked. We found out what worked for them and what didn't. And when we looked at what we were trying to accomplish internal to CAT with our process, the documents that we wanted to gather and review and manipulation and management of an internal database and even development of an internal database, once we really got into that, we were shocked at what we thought our manpower requirements were going to be to accomplish that. In fact, at Caterpillar, for just our U.S. facilities, to do the program the way we wanted to do it, we estimated that we were going to need between 13 and 15 full-time employees to run the process internally for us. And, you know, even if that's a, whatever, I'll throw a number out there, but if you say that's an employee that makes $50,000 a year, and you double that by adding the expense of their benefits in that, and then you multiply that times 13 or 15, you end up with quite a large cost associated with those resources. And we really didn't recognize that until after we spent, you know, a fair amount of time benchmarking with our peers. And so that's also another area where you need to go into it with your eyes open. Your company may have the best intentions, and they probably do, but I think a critical part of that is identifying what type of resources do you need to run this program. Again, the bigger the company, the more likely I think you are to be surprised at the amount of resources that you would take to effectively manage this program. And then I think this is number 10, and this is, I think this is a surprising event for both some companies that go into this and some contractors that go into this, and that's the fact that this is not a one-time event. It's a continuous process. It's, you know, a continual improvement process. Static compliance management just is not going to work. If you have that kind of mindset going in, you'll quickly find that you're not getting value out of this, and in fact, you're probably setting yourself up for some type of maybe catastrophic, maybe not, but I'll say a negative event by thinking that a one-time process is good enough. Contractor, supply chain cultures change with time. They improve, or they could actually get worse. Data needs to be updated on a regular basis. Things need to be kept current. And so it's an ongoing process, which again gets back to that resource piece of it. This is something you're going to want to be looking at, keeping fresh and live, and it takes resources to do that. Otherwise, you're just taking a snapshot in time, and you might be unfortunate to find out that a couple of weeks after you took your snapshot, something has changed, you know, and now you're potentially the victim of an unfortunate event. So I'll stress the fact that as you go through this process, it's not a one-time, one-step process. It's something that has to be live and ongoing.
Excellent point, Gil. You know, unfortunately, all the documents that a business wants to collect, it doesn't come due on the same date, the 31st of December for the injury logs, and so you have time to collect that up until you know, February. A lot of these documents come due from different companies at various stages, various points throughout the year, and to be able to be on top of that every day, every month is a very big challenge for a company to manage.
Yeah, it is. It's very much an ongoing process. Can't stress that enough. Last point I'll make, and this will come back to the point I made at the very beginning, and I think several points then, Pat's brought it up as well. The whole process, nobody wants to be involved with doing something that doesn't add value, that doesn't provide benefit to their company. And this is one of those areas, again, this is probably a sizable change to an operation. And so in order to continue to provide value, you really need to look at this as a continuous process improvement opportunity. And in fact, what I've seen is that if you don't kind of have that mindset, you may start out by gaining a lot of value with a program like this, but you get 2 or 3 years into the program, and you have a fairly mature program, and you're not looking to make continuous improvement in it, the amount of that value or benefit will start to drop off pretty quickly. And once that happens, first of all, you're losing the value and the benefit. Second of all, that means you're driving a process and resource requirements that aren't adding to the bottom line, and it just becomes a domino effect, because once leadership understands that, and rightfully so, they're not going to support that initiative. And so you really have to look at this as taking a management system approach, trying to drive continuous improvement, and continuing to add value to your organization. And that also kind of fits in with that crawl, walk, run model that I was talking about. You may start off with, what you think are relatively easy to meet selection criteria for the first year or couple of years of your program. But as you see your supply chain, grow and mature and hopefully get better in all the areas we talk about, again, not just EH&S, what you should be doing is looking to drive continuous improvement among them as well. You'll see the continuous improvement, but at some point you're probably going to have to raise the bar, both for your own internal benefit and again, it does benefit your supply chain as well. So it's important to keep that in mind. In the end, it has to add value.
Gil, I'd like to add just a little bit, a different slant or a little different color to this slide in terms of a challenge to businesses. And it's very important for businesses. They understand that they need to be compliant to regulations and requirements, protocols. What I'd like to suggest here is that concurrently, companies incorporate best practice management systems into their contractor qualification program. So not giving up on the compliance piece, but reaching out and adding a little bit more to it as a concurrent program. For example, we're a partner with the National Safety Council and through their journey to safety excellence. And one of the things the Safety Council talks about is moving the curve. So compliance is the first part of the curve, and most companies understand that either by their own volition or through forced circumstances. Then going out and seeing what else is out there and trying to think how they can improve their programs, and then implementing best practices. So that's what the council is trying to do, is trying to move the curve. And I think even with a contractor qualification program, we can move the curve. If you look at elements under the OSHA VPP, look at things that companies are doing to improve communications, employee engagement, all those kinds of things will improve their safety programs along the way.
Yeah, I agree. I doubt there's very many people on this call that think that if we're talking, I'm going to talk just on the safety side right now, or safety and health, or even environmental. Very few of you are probably under the belief that just meeting compliance is going to meet your needs or make you an industry leader. I mean, we've got a lot of big companies that are on this call. Most of them want to be best in class, best in the world, best among their peers. And just meeting compliance will never really get you there. And again, I'm probably preaching to the choir. And so using this continuous improvement and going beyond compliance will get you to that point. And you get a lot of benefits out of that. Again, we keep talking about that, but you have to, because nobody wants to get involved with something that doesn't provide benefit. It clearly adds to your bottom line. It adds to your stakeholder value. It adds to your business performance. But again, if I come back, I'm a safety professional, I have a hard time getting away from that. But I come back to the EH&S side of things, we work under a moral and ethical scope as well, and just meeting compliance and maybe just doing good enough in the realms of EH&S, morally and ethically, those aren't good enough, and most companies will support that, and their cultures would too. So going beyond compliance is a critical piece.
Agreed.
Okay. Probably a good thing. My voice is starting to get a little gravelly. Those are actually the top 10 failure points in a contractor pre-qualification process. I put them up here so you guys can, the folks on the phone can refer back to them, and this may lead to some of the questions. But I think at this point, we've got some time to go through some of the questions that have been submitted online. And so we'll start off with those, and you know, we'll either answer them directly or answer them as a tag team, but we'll try to answer your questions for you.
All right, great. Gil and Pat, this has really been informative. We've got a lot of great questions that are coming in. Just as a reminder, if you do have a question that you would like to submit, you can do that by going to the Q&A section of the WebEx. But as those come in, I'll just ask a couple that we've seen so far. You know, this is actually a pretty good segue. You guys were just talking about safety, EH&S specifically. But the question came in, you're talking a lot about safety. I work in procurement. How is this going to help me? Sounds like a great safety program.
Yeah, that's a good point. And in fact, we probably should have spent a little more time talking about the benefits to procurement. But, you know, I think we at least alluded to it in the process. It is more than just a safety-driven and safety-beneficial program. If you set this up properly and integrate it in with your current procurement processes, in a lot of cases, it will simplify and streamline the process that's already in place. And so you can look at things, procurement can use these tools and these type of programs to look at things well beyond the EH&S.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know a concern with the procurement side of it is they, a lot of times, they are the voice of that company. They're the ones that are awarding contracts, and they're working with departments, divisions across the country, across the globe in a lot of cases. So they need that repository for that information, and there's lots of information. You know, we talked about sustainability, quality systems, financial diversity, legal. Depends on the company. There's a lot of information, and they need access to that, and they need to know their list of suppliers that are qualified through company protocols to do the work that the business unit is asking them to do. They say, go out and find me an electrical contractor that has a diversity program in my state. That's a big challenge for them to find things like that, and having that platform so they have access to that allows procurement to do their job easier.
Yeah, and actually one thing that I just mentioned, guys, Browse has partnered with Experian to actually be able to pull in indicators of the contractor's financial stability. And so that's really been something that we've seen a lot of interest in from our procurement partners. Another question that came in, we have our own program. What are the advantages to using a third party? Will they have trouble understanding our suppliers?
Yeah, I think that's another really good question. And to be honest, I think there are a lot of advantages to it. We talked about the resource requirement to manage the processes. What we found when we did our benchmarking at Caterpillar, and what obviously a lot of the clients that use the third parties find, is that they can achieve the same ends, the same goals through a third party for far less expense than they can by staffing their own resources. I think another critical piece of that, especially when you're really doing a pre-qualification piece and enforcing those rules, by having the third party company measure and rate those contractors or supply chain, it takes the bias and or the possible conflict of interest out of that. And so the contractors that are meeting the company's requirements, those are the only ones being allowed to do the work. So those are a couple of areas. And then we also talked about technology. There just aren't a lot of companies out there that either already have the technology in place or have the resources to develop the technology, especially for a larger company, to be able to really streamline and automate that process to make it run as smoothly as they can. Because, again, the company needs to get the information in a timely manner. They need the information that is important to them, but it also has to be user-friendly and usable by the contractors of the supply chain as well. And a third party, in my opinion, really enhances those abilities.
Okay, great, guys. We're getting a lot of questions around the application and the technology itself. The first question was, are you going to show the application? And I wish we had the time to do that. Certainly, if you would like to see the Browse application and how that might be able to work with you and the challenges that you're facing, we'd be more than happy to set up a time to do that. But then the second question that came in, regarding lack of sophistication, what are the tools, software available to help with speeding up the process, both by the contractor completing the forms and dealing with all the supporting documentation involved? That might be a good question, guys, just to touch on what the application looks like, what tools are available. I know both of you have worked inside of that, creating programs of your own.
maybe I'll just add a piece to that. It kind of goes back to that. The last question as well is that when you have a managed program, if switching from an in-house program to a managed program, whoever that department is that has to make those calls to the suppliers and say, I need 15 sets of different types of documents, and that information comes in, and does it come in via electronic? Does it come in by mail? Does it fax? Is it clear to read? Is the information accurate? Well, those take thousands of hours for an in-house program to manage and put it in a form. So the ability to have someone else make those calls for you is a huge benefit, just that alone.
Okay, fantastic. Maybe I'll take just a minute, if it's okay, and maybe just talk about a typical implementation process and what that looks like in terms of setting up the application, what tools are involved. Typically, when somebody looks to engage a third party, and I'll use the example of Browse, we would come out and sit down, spend some time with those individual clients, try to understand what the challenges are that they're facing, what it is that they would specifically like to manage their supply chain against. As those elements are determined and as Browse shares best practices, we would then take that information and build that into our application, which is really an online assessment. Contractors and suppliers working with that client organization would then be invited to register and begin submitting documentation. So whether we're talking about historical safety stats, whether we're talking about insurance, we would collect the information, the supporting documents that have been requested, and then as an independent third party, work to validate that data. Some of the key features of the software itself, you've got the ability to see at a glance who does or does not meet your standards. As documentation is collected and scored, Browse renders very intuitive icons so that you can see who does or does not meet those standards. There are notifications that are sent out both to the contractor and supplier, as well as the buyer or the client organization. So if there are upcoming expirations, whether it be licenses or insurance, you would be notified, as would your supply chain. And then I think a really important part of that is we assign a single point of contact to every member of your supply chain to help to educate them to your requirements and answer any questions they might have. Other key functions within the application, we have the ability to track employee-level data, deliver online training, whether that be induction training or other programs that you have, and then track all of that, not only at the company level, but at the employee level of the contractors and suppliers you work with. There's also some very sophisticated audit functionality, covering a number of areas, but specifically safety management systems. So hopefully that gives you a little better sense of the tools, the application itself. But again, we'd love an opportunity to go into a deeper dive, and feel free to reach out to us, or we'll reach out to you if there's interest there. A couple of other questions that have come in. We work with lots of small local companies. We do this as part of our corporate initiatives. Can a third party work with all sizes of companies? I would hate to penalize smaller companies.
Yeah, I think the simple answer to that is yes. Especially, if you set your process up appropriately, you can clearly delineate requirements in that to differentiate between small-sized companies and larger companies, and you may have, similar, the same, or even completely different set of criteria, depending on, I think in this case it's really talking about company size. But yeah, again, if you go through this with your eyes open and a very thoughtful idea of the impact of what you're asking, and then the ability of the contractor to meet what you're asking, if you do that correctly up front, you can very easily handle, small size to mid-sized contractors. I know when we, I don't want to preach big yellow here, but when I did this at Caterpillar, we set our process up to have different rules and different requirements for everything from a single employee sole proprietor type company that does, that may also do just, a very minor amount of business with Caterpillar in the course of a year, all the way up to, I mean, we had contractors that were global in footprint with tens of thousands of employees, and we were able to tailor our program specifically to meet all of those areas and anything in between. So it can be done. It just has to be done in a thoughtful way.
And I'll just add, I think any company entering into a program like this, again, whether it's either managed in-house or through a third party, you're going to need to anticipate small-sized companies needing some help in terms of what is it that you're asking for, how do I submit that to you, can I submit it to you in various manners, medias, if you will. So they'll ask for clarification, and you'll need to dedicate resources or have resources dedicated that can communicate and establish a bond with that supplier.
Thanks, Pat. We got a question that came in from Shannon, and guys, we could probably spend an entire segment on this, but I'd be curious your thoughts. What do you suggest for obtaining funding for a tool? So I assume this is taking the idea to management, getting the buy-in that you talked about, Gil, and obtaining the funding for it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. Nothing's free anymore, and so what it comes down to really is that cost-benefit ratio. That's, I mean, to me, that's what it all boils down to. And so if this is something that you feel is important to you or your organization, then I think what you have to do is spend the time to highlight what the benefits are and what the associated value to your enterprise, your organization, or your mom and pop type business, whatever it is. You've got to be able to show this is why it's important to us and this is how it adds value to our business. If you get that, I still wouldn't say, I've been in the industry for 30 years, I still wouldn't say you got a 100% chance of getting the leadership support and the money to do it. It's probably, especially with the economy the way it is, it's probably a coin toss at this point. But without being able to show that value, you're going to struggle to do it. So you really have to identify why it's important and how it's going to help your company.
So just a couple of thoughts, and I'd be curious your experience. But, certainly one aspect of this is looking at the associated savings in terms of mitigating accidents within the supply chain, whether we're talking about litigation or the cost of an accident, a fatality, heaven forbid that were to happen. But then I think the other part of that is looking at the administrative costs. When you outsource to a third party, there are certainly financial savings when you consider the number of employees it would take to manage this type of a program. So, whether you're talking about 500 contractors or 1,000, you really need to have somebody there walking those members of the supply chain through a solution. Did you guys have any experience going through an exercise looking into how many FTEs it might take to manage a program?
We did at CAT, and I talked about that a little bit. It was when we just simply looked at it as far as our U.S. facilities, our U.S. footprint. It was significant for us. It was a staff of, again, it was an estimate, but we thought 13 to 15 full-time employees to be able to do that.
Okay, so those are probably good numbers to keep in mind as you approach management for this type of business.
Right. Interesting. I work for Xcel Energy, a large electric utility, and we came up with the number 12. So a little bit smaller than Caterpillar, but a large corporation. And Shannon, I think you're asking an excellent question, and you need to take a look at where are your risks to your company, where's your exposure, your liabilities. Those are costs that you can put dollars to. And then also, as Gil said, what are you currently spending to managing these things?
Right.
And you'll come up with a return on investment, and you'll be able to demonstrate there's some gaps and there's some current costs, and to help sell this program.
Yeah. Do I have time to add one more comment to that?
Yeah, you bet. And then maybe time for one more question.
Okay. Yeah. The other piece I was going to add to it, your pre-qualification process, it can be only health and safety focused. It can focus on or include all of those other things we talked about. But one of the things that we're seeing more and more that clients want to have a good feeling or a good understanding or have something checked or audited, and that is on the business continuity side. And that's critical because if you're talking about a key supplier or a key contractor for your business, having the ability to understand where they sit in relation to business continuity. If they were to if they were to have some type of significant event, what's their ability to get back up and running and provide whatever it is to you that you need, whether it's materials or service, product, whatever that is. I mean, that's a very direct link to your business, and that's one of the things that we're seeing measured more and more in the pre-qualification process, because as the companies become more sophisticated, you know, that's another risk that they've clearly identified that this type of program can help walk you through as well.
Okay, great. One other question came in, and guys, I may just fill this myself if that's okay. How fast can a supplier be qualified? Is there an abbreviated supplier qualification process that supports emergencies? Having spent the better part of my career in operations with Browse, I can speak to this. You know, a couple of things to keep in mind. Depending on the way that you stratify risk within your supply chain, and I know Gil touched on this a little bit, Browse is able to configure a solution based on the type of work that a contractor performs. And so a smaller organization who may not present as high of risk to your company as maybe somebody who is working at height, chances are they're going to be able to become compliant that much faster. Now, certainly one component of that is the type of information you're asking for, but also how readily available the information is to the contractor. The other thing just to keep in mind is that there are solutions, and Browse has a process that would allow you, if you identified risk in your supply chain, and for example, you've got a contractor who has had some poor performance historically in the area of safety, there are tools that you can use to say, yes, we identify or acknowledge that there's risk here. We're still willing to do business and help to essentially provide an override to that process. In some cases, I think it's important to be realistic. A contractor may never become compliant, again, if you have requirements tied to historical performance. But there are tools to manage that.
You know, Brett, maybe I can just add to that. Another scenario is that you've got your list of qualified contractors that you're working with, but some type of emergent situation comes up and you need a supplier that you don't have readily available within your supply chain for a given type of work. There is a process within the system to allow a contractor to come on site in a short-term basis. You can request to have a project management plan on site for that given situation. So how are you addressing this given situation? You can request certain extra supervision on site. So there are ways to go through some protocols within your own company, saying that we have this company that we need to get on site. We haven't vetted them through everything that we normally do, but here's what we're going to do to mitigate that risk in advance, and having them observed and watched on site, getting their work done. It may be a short duration job that they can get in and still within your safety program.
Yeah, and this is Gil, I would tack one more thing onto that. I think having heard this probably, you already know this, or this may have registered on you, but I'm going to point it out anyway. And that is, it's in my mind, it's critical to understand that if you're going to have a well-developed, value-added contractor safety management program, my word for it, it's also critical, I think, that you understand that pre-qualification is just one piece of it. You're going to have other parts of that program. If you choose to use a third party like Browse to do your pre-qualification piece, there's probably still several other legs to the stool that you're going to be doing internally, like on-site audits of your contractors and things like that. It was one of the things I actually found with some of the leadership at Caterpillar was the belief that the pre-qualification piece was everything. And if we did that, we could manage our contractors the way we wanted to. And it took, again, some real change management and communication to get the organization to understand, it's more than just the pre-qualification piece. So you can't just totally hang your hat on that.
Okay, thanks, guys. Leo, just to make sure we answered your question, I think the ultimate answer is it depends on the requirements that you have, but when working with a third party like Browse, we can move as quickly as the contractor can provide the information. And there are processes to expedite a contractor's compliance when there is a deadline for them to be on site. Guys, we're at the top of the hour. It's been a fantastic discussion. For those of you that are on the phone, we will be following this up with an email, providing a recording of today's presentation. We really appreciate the time that you've taken. We hope that we've answered your questions. In the event that we haven't, please feel free to reach out to any of us. We'd be more than happy to answer those questions. And just wish everyone a great afternoon. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.